A pal for Gary? More like a nightmare for Gary. This SpongeBob episode is mediocre. I really love watching SpongeBob. I'm a SpongeBob fan just like the rest of you. But this particular episode is horrible just like hell. In this episode, SpongeBob felt bad for Gary because Gary was home alone while SpongeBob was working at the Krusty Krab. Mr. Krabs suggested for SpongeBob to go to an exotic pet shop around the corner from the Krusty Krab. That pet shop only sold exotic monster fish pets which were available in neon colors. They may look cute, but if you expose them to typical pets such as dogs or cats, they become aggressive and can cause harm to the pets. SpongeBob clearly did not understand the rules of owning one of those exotic monster fish pets when the lady was giving him instructions. SpongeBob just took one of those pets off the shelf without paying for it. When SpongeBob got home, he named the green exotic monster fish pet Puffy Fluffy. He introduced Puffy Fluffy to his snail Gary. Gary was shy of Puffy Fluffy. Gary then became scared of Puffy Fluffy after Puffy Fluffy got aggressive at him. SpongeBob encouraged Gary to play with Puffy Fluffy. Gary squeaked on his squeaky carrot toy. Puffy Fluffy became aggressive and destroyed Gary's precious toy. SpongeBob also wanted Gary and Puffy Fluffy to share food together in the same bowl. But Puffy Fluffy gobbled up all of the food. Gary did not get any of the food at all. After those two conflicts, Gary hid under the television. SpongeBob was careless about Gary. He wanted Gary to be nice to a pet who oppressed him. Puffy Fluffy destroyed his squeaky toy and ate all of the food which was for him and Gary to share. Why would SpongeBob defend Puffy Fluffy if he is doing bad things? SpongeBob needed to train Puffy Fluffy to be nice to Gary instead of vice versa. Puffy Fluffy should have been punished for oppressing Gary. Gary was innocent. Puffy Fluffy was guilty. When it was bedtime, SpongeBob made Gary sleep in the same bed as Puffy Fluffy. Gary was terrified of sleeping with Puffy Fluffy. I don't blame Gary. However, Puffy Fluffy grew larger and escaped the bed to go to the kitchen. Puffy Fluffy was causing devastating damage to SpongeBob's property. At that same time, Puffy Fluffy was being frightening to Gary. Gary fought Puffy Fluffy back. Gary did the right thing by defending himself from him. SpongeBob woke up while it was like 3 in the morning because of the riots that Puffy Fluffy and Gary were causing against each other. Puffy Fluffy had 4 mouths. He was holding Gary in one of them. Puffy Fluffy was using one of his other mouths to bite on Gary's eye. When SpongeBob saw that, he told Gary to put Puffy Fluffy down right now. But Puffy Fluffy was larger than Gary. Puffy Fluffy was holding Gary, not vice versa. Gary was being punished by SpongeBob all because he was the victim of Puffy Fluffy. Why couldn't SpongeBob punish Puffy Fluffy instead? If SpongeBob wanted to buy a pet to entertain Gary while he was working at the Krusty Krab, he should have bought another snail that was just like Gary. The snail would have got along with Gary better than Puffy Fluffy. I wish a Nickelodeon would recreate this whole episode in which SpongeBob would be accusing Puffy Fluffy every time he harms Gary. Puffy Fluffy should be locked up in a cage every time he does something like chewing up Gary's squeaky toy. I will always be a fan of SpongeBob. But I will not be a fan of the episode I just ranted about. This concludes my rant. Thanks for watching.